In the first Gladiator, Russell Crowe plays Maximus. And in the sequel, we learn pretty quickly that, well, Maximus has been dead for 15 years. So it's going to sort of jumpstart us ahead that way. So I thought the story was warranted. And goodness knows, in ancient Rome, there's any any number of things to hold your interest. There is the spectacle, which is really well mounted here. It's really fun to watch at that level, and not just in the Colosseum where you enjoy watching people being killed by wild animals. Not just that, because we're part of that crowd too. Come on, fess up. We're watching it too.
Hello, and welcome to At the Movies with Mike and Marie, a show where two film professors talk about movies. I'm Marie Westhaver.
And I'm Mike Giuliano.
And today we're going to talk about Wicked and Gladiator II, starting with Wicked. So, Mike, I first want to ask, because of the whole Barbenheimer thing, when Barbie and Oppenheimer came out, a lot of people ganged them together and watched them together, so it was Barbenheimer. So there was some talk on the internet about Glicked, people who went to see Gladiator and Wicked together. Did you?
Well, I've seen both films. I didn't watch them back to back. That even for me, that would have been sort of mind stretching, I guess. But what happens here is some releases are deliberately planned in such a way that it's going to coincide or overlap with whatever else is on the map. But most often, in a case like this, it's maybe not entirely coincidental, but tends to be. So I don't make too much of that in terms of why this with that, on the same weekend, because it sometimes just happens. And what happens, though, after the fact, if they're both successful, as with the examples you've cited, then at that point, it's the equivalent of Monday morning quarterbacking, as in, well, that's why these two. And then, of course, it gets into the sort of cutesy phase of, well, what sort of moniker to put on them. And so I don't make too much of that. However, how can I not make something of it? Because we have to talk today. So I'll make something of it. The one thing that Wicked and Gladiator 2 have in common is that both movies involve angry monkeys. And so that may be the secret agenda here as to what links these two films. Now, since we're talking first about the monkeys in Wicked, we need to do the math on this, or at least I feel the need to do that. And it sort of brings out the accountant in me, among other things, because these films have done extremely well at the box office. And we then tend to think about genealogy in both a creative and a fiscal sense, if you will, and in any event, a numerical sense. So just to give some of the backstory on this, Wicked, as we all know, so I'll say it anyway, began as a Broadway musical in 2003. And I have to say, mine is a minority voice, not the first time, in that I liked it well enough, I suppose, and yet I know that it has a fanatical fan base. That's what a fan base is. And so I realized that for my money, I just thought it was oftentimes underscoring the obvious, if you will. Thematically, it just sort of clubs you that way, and the score is agreeable, and it's good fun. So yeah, I'll sort of leave it at that. But the numbers, let's run the numbers. When I saw the original Broadway production of Wicked, which has been playing forever, the entire show has a running time of 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's it. From Act One, Act Two, it adds up to 2 hours and 40 minutes. Now, lo, these many years later, in November of 2024, we get Wicked Part One, which, you know what? Has a running time of 2 hours and 40 minutes. I mean, to the minute, the same. And it only takes you up through Act One of the musical, essentially. And so part two of the film is scheduled for release in November of 2025. So for me, this is like a prime example of what I call franchise expansion or extension, if you prefer it that way. Have you no shame sort of thing. And actually, that was my major reservation about the film. And I have a number of reservations about what's really an enjoyable film in a lot of ways, but the fact that it's really stretched out, it's really drawn out. And again, in terms of being, heavy-handed and just clubbing you thematically, oftentimes I get the point, and then there's another scene or an extended scene. I think, okay, enough already. I get it. What ultimately works for me here is that the film is so performance driven. So in terms of the actresses, Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande playing Elphaba and Glinda, when they're on screen, particularly together, a lot of the interplay, just simply the dynamics of two gifted actors, carries it. It'll carry a scene that otherwise I think is kind of clubbing me. And that gives, some pleasure just watching the two of them perform. But then there'll be stretches where either they're off the camera, if you will, or simply it's a, a spectacle scene. And that's actually one of my reservations. A lot of it seems to be spectacle for the sense of spectacle. And yeah, it's good eye candy that way, but how much candy can you eat? This is a rhetorical question. How much candy can you eat in one sitting? So Marie, with all those semi-sour observations, let me turn it back over to you.
All right, I love that you said how much candy can you eat. I can apparently eat a lot of candy. And one of the notes I made when I was watching the movie was it was kind of bubblegum fun. And you win the internet for angry monkeys. I mean, that's just a brilliant observation. And I agree with you 100% about the runtime. I think that's unnecessary. I think it's actually kind of taxing your audience to say, we're only going to tell you half the story. But I will give them this. I felt like at the end of the movie, I'd had a full movie experience. It didn't feel so much like a cliffhanger. It was more like you can come back and spend time with these people. So let me just give you a different point of view. I remember finding the Oz books in the library and finding out there was more than just The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. There's several books about Oz. So I read all of those. And then when Gregory Maguire came out with Wicked, I thought, what a great take, to give you like a backstory of a character in a sympathetic way. So I remember reading the books back in the day. So when they decided, I've never seen the Broadway musical, but when they made a movie of it, I thought, what a perfect opportunity to take something like The Wizard of Oz, which was a great musical, and then do something kind of like it, but with today's technology. I love the way they built all of these realistic sets instead of relying so much on CGI. I thought the characterizations were wonderful, very true to the book. The Have You No Shame. I understand where you're coming from, Mike, because I mean, sequelitis is a thing, but I kind of felt like I did with Barbie, where they understood their audience, that they wanted to come back to Oz and be wowed by that sensation of things you saw in the original Wizard of Oz, where if you watch it now, when you see the Emerald City, it's just so kind of pathetic compared to what we can do now. So I enjoyed going back to Oz. I wanted to stay there, and I really enjoyed the characters. And I want to mention that the character Elphaba, her name is that because it's a take on the author's name, L. Frank Baum, the initials, Elphaba. So there's so many references to the movie, really the movie, not the books, because in the books she was not green. There's lots of things that are really about the movie. The witch's hat that they kind of showed reflected upside down. It looks like a tornado. It just lots of things from the movie. It was sort of a celebration of the Wizard of Oz. Plus, it was definitely made for people who really enjoy musical theater. The singing performances are incredible, and a lot of them are done live, which is, I mean, that's just not something you usually get. You don't get this caliber of talent, and I don't know, the sweeping scope, the believability of it. I mean, the train alone, Mike. I think people should go see the movie just for that train.
The train was really neat, and you and I are agreeing on the central point, namely that it is performance driven. And Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande, as they perform, it is actually a really good link to musical theater. By that I mean, as they're performing, you feel like these are two real live performers, and they're singing, direct to me, and you don't feel like it's something that was recorded later, post sync, this and that. And without getting into the technical weeds, I mean, you can oftentimes tell in a film when something's been sort of pasted together or layered that way. But here you really feel, much as you would if you were sitting in a theater, really watching these performers singing all out directly at you. So it's not just that these are really gifted performers, but there's that sense of live performance as you watch the movie. And I got to say, again, I don't mind constantly confessing that mine's a minority voice, because when the film was over, I thought, okay, that's it. I was sitting in a crowded theater, and there was a lot of applause at the end. Admittedly, my hands were not clapping, but I was observing as a journalist would, the other hands clapping, and I thought, you can't deny a film that works for an audience, and to be able to acknowledge that, and realizing I'm not part of the fan club on that, but I can sincerely appreciate it. In terms of one of your other points about special effects capability, I actually prefer the 1939 version, which is a perfect film in so many ways, even with its imperfections, if you will. And one reason I prefer it is there is a kind of quaint and charming quality to what would have been state-of-the-art special effects for that era. I actually like that a lot. I think it's a mixed blessing in terms of the capabilities we have now, because I said before, one reason why the film is pushing over 2 hours, indeed 2 hours and 40 minutes, is the fact that if you can do it, you will do it. And I think that happens. Folks sit down with special effects, they can overwhelm a story. They can overwhelm a lot there. And at times, to me, it just felt like empty spectacle in that sense. It was just, again, candy for the sake of eye candy, if you will. So again, I really think that's, on the one hand, something we can do and do so convincingly, but maybe that's not always a virtue. In terms of the central characters, they really are both in their own very different ways endearing. Elphaba, for my money, for anyone's, she has to be green because it's the whole essence of her being a misunderstood character. Is that, well, what sets her apart? What makes her so different? And again, it's one of those classic stories of, well, if you're green, that'll do it, and everything that pens to that. And again, there's really a pathos, considering the sort of like quasi-cartoonish qualities of so much of this. There's a real pathos to her, and this is where the actor really brings that out. It's quite moving at times. Just sometimes her facial reactions as people shun her at school. And by the way, the school, if you will, I love the way. I mean, actually, visually, it's well realized. But another reviewer had described it as Hogwarts with Munchkins, and it does, and it does have that quality to it, which made me smile all the way through. But in terms of Elphaba as a character here, this is where, on the one hand, I'm with her, sympathetic. I would vote for her in any number of ways. And yet where it gets really heavy-handed, really loaded on. Okay, so this story, the Wicked story, is prototypical feminist kind of story. And yes, I agree with that. I'm all for that. But boy, it gets underscored a lot here. So you couldn't possibly miss the point. As if that weren't enough, Elphaba is also an animal rights activist, and I'm voting for her on that too. She's got that on her side, and she's a political activist. Now, in terms of what exactly she wants in Oz, this is somewhat open-ended as to politically what would the structure look like, but she wants some reforms and so on. And I just think a lot is loaded on there. But again, the performance totally captivates. In terms of Ariana Grande, she does a really good job of playing this ostensibly good-hearted character. And to me, what made me smile, and it's actually a connection with your opening question and observations, she really plays it like Barbie. But this is a Barbie who smiles and is sweet and this and that, but who has an agenda. And so she might not put a knife in your back, but she is looking out for number one there, but she makes it seem like she's looking out for everybody. And it's actually a very skillful performance to have that surface sweetness and good-heartedness, sort of the Girl Scout award, but then to realize, well, she's got some self-interest going here, and we can see it, and the other characters to varying degrees may or may not see it. But anyway, having those two play off each other works well. What doesn't convince me completely in the dynamics of this is the point at which Elphaba and Glinda, nay Glinda, the point at which these two will become friends. I never quite fully bought it. I always felt like it was a plot twist that was essential. In other words, they have to have it turn this way. Let me ask you that. Let's do some armchair psychoanalysis, Marie. To what extent do you think Elphaba and Glinda would go from being antagonists to frenemies to friends?
Wow, you've given me so much to respond to. And I've been frantically making notes while you were talking because you make so many great points. All right, I first want to start with when The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939, what everybody remarked about was how it started off in black and white. And when you got to Oz, everything turned into Technicolor. And it was so amazing. So I feel like Wicked had to do something with CGI just to kind of, in terms of a reference point to The Wizard of Oz, where you see something you've never seen before. And I just want to say, goats teaching classes, I would totally be on board for that. I love the way they animated the animals, just absolutely fabulous. In terms of the friendship between Elphaba and Glinda, if you read the Wicked book, it would totally make sense because it actually skips that whole part where they undermine each other until they realize, they could actually be friends and had things in common. So I didn't find that hard to believe at all. What I found hard to believe was the kind of cinematic thing where you can't be friends until first you're enemies. I also loved, I know what's coming in the second version, and when you meet Nessa, her sister, you realize in the back of your mind, if you remember The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the East was her sister. So, you're sort of seeing like the birth of what's going to come in The Wizard of Oz. And by the way, I want to mention that Judy Garland's kids all approved this film. So, there's nothing there where they feel like their mother's legacy was, impinged upon her at any point. Also, love the fact that Ariana Grande apparently saw the premiere with her grandmother. In some ways, she plays a character that's not supposed to be sympathetic, but she is. And she does a great job with everything she's given, acting, singing. The one thing that I did think was sort of ridiculous was you're living in a world where goats teach classes and there's flying monkeys, and you're shocked that somebody has green skin.
Yeah, logic takes a holiday sometimes in the film, and you're absolutely right about that. And some of the most enjoyable scenes, and Peter Dinklage, by the way, is voicing Dr. Dillamon, the goat, and those are really funny scenes. Actually, they really are very cleverly realized, and the supporting cast actually is quite good. Oftentimes, Michelle Yeoh plays Madame Morrible, this dragon lady type character, and that is spilling into cartoonish, but you need that kind of fun in the film. And Jeff Goldblum actually is a rather endearing Wizard of Oz. So there's a lot. And also, let's put in a word for Jonathan Bailey, who plays this Prince Fiora, who he really is like a cutout figure. He's really this dashing, heroic-looking figure. And I love, like, when he walks in, like, all eyes turn on him, like, whoa, look who just walked in the room. And so it is sort of funny that way. And he's so proudly superficial. I love the line where he says, like, life is painless for the brainless. And again, the film is actually a lot of fun at that level watching it. I was making mental notes as you made your observations there. And when you mentioned that Judy Garland's children all approve of it, well, now I can sleep better at night. I'm happy to hear this.
I want to mention, since you brought up Jonathan Bailey, that here's another thing where they know their audience. He was a major character in Bridgerton. And in this movie, he rides a horse, which he did in Bridgerton. So we asked for the same horse because he felt like, he knew that horse. So in terms of like actors asking to work against other actors, sort of interesting that he asked for a special horse to be reassigned to him. But we do need to flip over to Gladiator II, Mike. So any final words you want to say about Wicked?
Yeah, the one creative figure we haven't mentioned yet, ironically, is the director, John Chu.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, oops, there's somebody on the
Oops.
list. Oops. But, think about his filmography. I mean, from Crazy Rich Asians, yes, he can direct comedy. From In the Heights, yes, he can direct a musical. So he actually was a good choice for this. I think sometimes the production sort of runs away from him here. He's working with so much big budget, big spectacle. And again, I don't think that always works in the film's favor. But he does oversee it. And you know what? A crowd pleaser is a crowd pleaser. So let's move on from one crowd pleaser to the next.
All right. So Gladiator 2, so much hype coming into it, so many expectations, so much to live up to because the first one was such a huge, huge hit. But at the end of the day, what did you think about, first of all, with the question of, did this movie even need to be made? I know people like to ask that question in terms of Wicked. I mean, no movie ever needs to be made, really. But in this case, I think people were really angry about the fact that they tried to mess with a classic, where with Wicked, I don't feel like there was this immediate sense of, I'm going into this thinking I'm not going to like it.
Well, this is a case, usually I speak against sequelitis, and you've heard me go on at great length, my sequels as I go on against it. But this is a case where I actually felt the sequel, much belated, was justified. So some backstory on it in an admiring sense. I had interviewed Ridley Scott back in 1979 when he was doing Alien, still one of his best films. And what I admire so much is his technical mastery. He has great confidence as a filmmaker. He really gives you a film that's well put together. And I like some of them better than others, but I always have a degree of confidence as I'm watching his films as well. He recently turned 87. He's still working. I mean, these are all things to admire here. The first Gladiator I liked well enough. I didn't share quite as much enthusiasm as other folks have for it, but I acknowledge, again, the accomplishment there on dramatic and really technical level, just in terms of a sword and sandal epic. It's really well done. Indeed, it won the Best Picture Academy Award and Russell Crowe Best Actor and so on. So I understand where you're coming from. Should you make a sequel to this? Obviously, they had it on the shelf, and however many years they mulled it over, because the first film, Gladiator, came out in 2000. Now here you and I are talking in 2024, and finally we get Gladiator 2. That's a long time to wait for a sequel. One reason why I approved, if not to ask my approval, but one reason why I approved of the notion of a sequel here was the fact that they justify it in the scripting. Because in the first Gladiator, Russell Crowe plays Maximus. And in the sequel, we learn pretty quickly that, well, Maximus has been dead for 15 years. So it's going to sort of jumpstart us ahead that way. So I thought the story was warranted. And goodness knows, in ancient Rome, there's any any number of things to hold your interest. There is the spectacle, which is really well mounted here. It's really fun to watch at that level, and not just in the Colosseum where you enjoy watching people being killed by wild animals. Not just that, because we're part of that crowd too. Come on, fess up. We're watching it too. I don't know about the sharks, but we're watching all that too. But also at the level of palatial intrigue, you can't go wrong with that in ancient Rome in terms of all kinds of aberrant behavior at the highest levels. And the casting here is quite good in terms of the people doing all the misbehavior. So that really has all that going for it here. Now, where it starts to lose me, and this is actually where I do have somewhat mixed feelings about Ridley Scott on occasion, is that he's really great at mounting a period piece, at getting hundreds of people on the battlefield, all things like that. He's terrific at all that. At the dramatic level, not always quite so much. Even though there's this very solid cast here and the plot dynamics are in place, and you and I will talk some more about that for sure. One thing is he can be rather heavy-handed with the dramatics. For instance, here, I'm not an authority on this. I don't know exactly how people spoke in ancient Rome, but I was following the line readings in this film. You get two actors squaring off, and you and I will talk about the specifics of the intrigue of the melodrama. But anyway, two people square off, and they speak in such a deliberate and weighty way that you could drive a chariot between their words. And I'm watching it thinking, I guess people, when they knew they were saying something important on the floor of the Roman Senate, would have that kind of declamatory tone. But even in what should be intimate conversations, just two people in a bedroom or something, they still talk that same way. So I don't want you to talk that way necessarily, but how did that strike you at the dramatic level?
Well, I think there were a lot of problems with the dramatic level, but I just want to mention a couple of things that I thought were well done. The whole you have a successful movie and then you do a son of is something Hollywood does all the time. So in terms of why was this movie made? Because they could, because it's an interest, it's epic. And this is where I'm with you with Ridley Scott. I mean, he's almost 90, but he could still mount this sort of epic, sweeping story about something no less than ancient Rome. I mean, there's a lot going on there. But having said that, and he does it incredibly well, not everybody could. And by the way, he sold the set from Kingdom of Heaven to the Moroccan government for $10 because it was cheaper than dismantling it. And then he had to like rehire it from the same government for the opening shot of the city. Just interesting aspects of the movie that could only be Ridley Scott. But there's too many characters. It takes way too long to figure out who's who and what's what. I think it suffers from that. But in terms of what they do, because you're going to the Colosseum and you're going to see mayhem. I mean, filling it with water and sharks and those like apes at first. I mean, so incredibly terrifying. Just in terms of what they bring to life for you when you think, okay, we're going to go back to the Roman Empire, and there's going to be like these evil emperors. And by the way, the twin evil emperors, stroke of genius to cast two guys who look like Joffrey from Game of Thrones, because the sadism and the lust for blood just felt right. And you were just so, it kind of carried over that character from Game of Thrones to these two guys. So when they got their just desserts, it was so satisfying.
Yeah, you know what? You and I, we're talking about the spectacle inside the Colosseum, and the fight sequences are horrific. And I mean, this is not new to us, but to actually see that, and more graphic than it would have been in the 1950s sword and sandal epic. So yeah, it really is scary. But if anything, far scarier isn't just the bloodlust in the audience, and there's quite a crowd there cheering all this, but those twin emperors, they're so creepy.
So creepy.
They really are. And that's actually even scarier than any of the wild animals down in the Colosseum floor. And so that's again where Scott is pointing out to us, look at human nature. I mean, look at how this audience is rabid. But you and I are in complete agreement, actually, that dramatically, I was complaining actually about when I say line readings, I mean just simply the the gravitas of it. It takes itself so seriously there, and just not that it has to lighten up, but just be a little more naturalistic with dialogue, for instance. But also, there are a lot of characters, and many, you're right, there are many secondary ones, and it takes a while to really get going, and occasionally sort of stalls that way. The film has a running time of 148 minutes, which is not excessive really for a film like this, but again, a case where some tightening might have helped. I think with the exposition to get to the essence of it a bit more, because it really is a son of type story. You're absolutely right. And it just takes a while to get that fully established. In terms of the secondary performances, some of them really are, enjoyable. And I'll single out Denzel Washington and the character he plays, because he actually plays a slave owner who controls, the corral, if you will, of gladiators. And one thing I like about the film here is that it makes comments about race, but implicitly. We tend to think about race in our country, understandably, of course, in terms of black and white. But in ancient Rome, you had slaves of various colors and various ethnicities and so on. Because after all, as the Roman Empire expanded, when you conquered another people, they became your slaves in a lot of ways. So some of the slaves were white, some were black, some were this and that. And the film reflects a lot of that without really overtly commenting, even though it's heavy-handed in other ways. The fact that, yes, you might have a black character who himself is owning and controlling slaves and so on. And it's just part of it. And Denzel Washington, of course, is always a great pleasure to watch. And he has actually a relatively understated performance here. And so when he slows down his line readings, it's terrific because you're watching his face. And also, it's a reminder that he's also getting up there. He's 70 years old, and he's in that senior rank of great actors now. And for me, a reminder of, as you and I are talking, next year, Denzel Washington will be playing Othello on Broadway. And I think this is something of a tryout for that, because when you look at the way he's dressed and the way he's speaking and so on, I think he's already running his lines for Othello here.
I think you make a great point with Othello, and I'm glad you brought up Denzel Washington, because here's another thing people are criticizing is his New York accent, where everybody else is attempting, something else. But I read some reviews where he said, well, who actually knows what people would sound like back then? And he's got a point. I don't know what like a legitimate ancient Roman accent would sound like. So I
You know,
thought every time he showed up on the screen, it was like, oh my God, it's Denzel. What is he going to do? And they gave him a fun role to play. So that's fun to watch.
See, he has a more naturalistic approach to the acting, and it didn't bother me at all that he has what we're calling a New York accent, because maybe that's truer to ancient Rome than what, because think about all the sword and sandal epics that we've seen, and many of them, most of them actually Hollywood films, but when the actors speak, some of the actors are American, some are British, some are whatever, but they tend to have what I call stage British accents, right? There's often
Mhm.
like the Roman Senate. I thought, well, what? They sound like the House of Parliament. The House of Parliament. I mean, is this how they talked in ancient Rome? There are conventions that we carry with us as to how we think people spoke in any given time. And I think Ridley Scott, not that he has a tin ear necessarily, but he's so good at the action sequences, at the spectacle and so on, at the immersion in ancient Rome. Even though, Denzel Washington has what we're calling a New York accent, and so I think it's every bit as valid as this really heavy-handed, really weighed down line readings that the other characters have, and somehow that became the convention. And so you would think it's the Houses of Parliament, that we're visiting here. But yeah, I think we should single him out because there are some good performances here in the film.
Well, I want to mention that since we were just talking about Wicked, that next spring, you and I will be hosting a film series discussion about musicals. And if you would like to be added to the mailing list, send us an email at movies@howardcc.edu. And that brings to the end of our show. But don't forget to look up our other episodes on atmhcc.podbean.com. And we'll see you next time at the movies.
See you then.
Thank you for listening to Dragon Podcast. You can find this episode and all other Howard Community College podcasts available for your listening pleasure on all streaming platforms, as well as Podbean at podbean.com/Dragon Podcast.